It's lovely to see so many of you here. My name is Meyers, and I'm a research fellow at the Centre for European Reform, focusing on technology and innovation policy issues. Thank you for joining us at this webinar, which is generously supported by AIG, on how the EU can navigate the US-China digital divide. It's a very interesting time for us to be tackling this topic. Yesterday, the European Commission announced it was suspending political steps to ratifying its investment treaty with China. And today, the Commission has just published a new industrial strategy and a draft regulation to address foreign subsidies, which is clearly aimed at China. We have a wonderful panel of speakers who I will introduce shortly. I do need to let you know that Dr. Tom Kernan at the Federation of German Industries did plan to be with us today, but regrettably, he wasn't able to join the panel due to ill health. I'll run today's seminar in the following way. Firstly, I'll ask each of the panelists to provide some brief introductory remarks. And we'll then spend most of the time on an interactive Q&A, where I will invite questions from the audience for the panelists. Please be aware that we'll be recording the opening statements and they will be publicly available. However, the Q&A will be held under the Chatham House rule. This means that participants can use the information they receive during the discussion, but you should not attribute it to a particular person. Most of this event, as I said, will be an interactive Q&A, so we very much welcome your questions and input. If you'd like to ask a question during the session, you can raise your hand using the button at the bottom of your screen. I'll then invite you to ask the question live. However, if you don't wish to ask the question live, or you can't bear to wait to the Q&A session, you can also type it into the chat at any time, and then I'll read it out to the panelists if time permits. Before we get started, I'd again like to acknowledge the generous support of AIG for this webinar series. And I'd like to invite Alex Nagler, Managing Director of AIG for Germany, Austria, and Switzerland, to provide a few introductory remarks.
Thank you, Zach. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the latest webinar in the CER and AIG series on geopolitics. Geopolitical risk is a topic of enormous importance to AIG and clients operating around the globe. We are living through a period of new and intense geopolitical instability, which affects the environment for business, trade, and investment in a profound and unprecedented ways. At the heart of the present fluidity in the international systems are the evolving relationships between Europe on the one hand and the US and China on the other. The aim of this series is to focus on some of the critical fault lines in those relationships. Last time we looked at the transatlantic relationship through the prism of climate and energy. This time, the lens is on challenge to Europe of the growing digital power struggle between the US and China. The CER have convened an exceptional panel of expertise to discuss this key question, and I am particularly pleased that once again, we have participation of the BDI in representing the business voice. Unfortunately, I think not here today. It is AIG's belief, reflected in our relationship with the CER, now in its 7th year, that there is great value in bringing together policymakers, business, and expertise from think tanks and academia to discuss the pressing geopolitical and geoeconomic issues. I'm sure today's discussions will demonstrate events like this can only lead to deeper insight and shared understanding. With that, I'd like to thank our partners in the CER and our distinguished speakers and hand back to Zach. Many thanks.
Thanks very much, Alex. We'll now move on to the introductory remarks from the distinguished panelists that we have for today's discussion. To introduce them briefly, we have Dr. Aynne Kokas, who's an Associate Professor of Media Studies at the University of Virginia and a non-resident scholar in Chinese media at the Rice University's Baker Institute. And she's an expert in data security in the media industry. We have Caroline Meinhardt, an analyst at the Mercator Institute for China Studies, or MERICS, in Berlin. Caroline's an expert in China's industrial strategy, in particular in the area of emerging technologies. And we have Mr. Alex Roth, Deputy Head of the China Division at the German Federal Foreign Office. I'd like to ask Dr. Kokas to make some introductory remarks first. Dr. Kokas, maybe you can start by telling us a bit about the EU's compartmentalised approach to China and your views on whether it's a realistic path for the EU.
Thank you so much, Zach, and thank you to CER and AIG for having me here today. It's a pleasure to be part of this distinguished panel and to learn from all of you. I think this is a crucial area of importance and something that we're following very closely in the US. I'm particularly interested in how the European compartmentalized approach tries to navigate this challenging environment between the United States and China, as the US and China are increasingly engaged in not just economic competition, but also security competition. The European Union has taken a different approach, this kind of attempt to segment different areas of interest rather than the US approach, which is kind of integrating trade and security more closely. Now, that being said, this makes European relations with China much more complicated. The EU views China as a partner, as a competitor, and as a systemic rival. So that requires wearing a lot of different hats in a lot of different organizations. And it's frankly not a position that I would envy. I see the challenges that many of the diplomats and figures in military and trade will be facing. Now, within a trade context, it's interesting in the sense that in the European context, there's far more dependence on trade and investment with China than the US has. Now, this creates a particularly interesting environment within the digital landscape where we see European countries trying to assess whether or not they want to deal with the data exploitation of US companies or the data exploitation of Chinese companies, and which they feel more comfortable with, which frankly, as someone who studies both countries, I would feel comfortable with neither. So it's very reasonable to be looking at the possibility of developing European competitors. But as we have seen, this is a very difficult path to follow, particularly given Europe's more conservative regulatory environment for the tech industry. And this is clearly the kind of at the crux of this challenge. On one hand, as an American, I look at the European digital regulatory landscape and I feel very envious that there are all of these protections for personal data and protections against corporations. And then at the EU level, there becomes a challenge of how does Europe then compete with countries that don't have those same regulations and are developing their own national champions. And I think this is going to be a really central issue that Europe will be facing over the next 5 to 10 years. And I don't have an answer for it, but I did want to pose it as something that I see looking from the outside. Europe obviously has significant interests in maintaining good economic relations with both the United States and China and not choosing between them, a path which is increasingly difficult for not just Europe, but for countries like Japan, Australia, countries in Southeast Asia. One advantage that Europe has, as I see it, is not engaging in the same kind of geopolitical and national security concerns in the Indo-Pacific that the United States engages in. First of all, it allows for a kind of focus on the type of engagement with China and the possibility for a more constructive engagement that doesn't necessarily include questions of freedom of navigation in the South China Seas or other issues that have repeatedly created difficulties in US-China trade relations. And as a result, these European interests in economic terms do allow a little bit more flexibility in terms of engaging with China. That being said, there's a very long and robust tradition of European engagement in the human rights landscape. And I would argue maybe even more so than within the international human rights landscape. And I would argue even in some cases more robustly than in the United States, which is a challenge as we see what is happening in Xinjiang and in Hong Kong. So these will become, I think, increasing challenges when trying to even navigate basic digital concerns. Now, bringing up this question of Hong Kong, we also have everyone is going to be impacted by the extraterritorial enforcement of laws related to the Hong Kong national security law. So it is, even if Europe is trying to stay away from this question of national security in trade relations with China, in some ways it's being brought to their doorstep. Now, in terms of cooperation, I think that one thing that I look at with great envy as an American is the kind of continued environmental cooperation between China and between China and the European Union. And I think that this has the foundation to build out the potential for tech collaboration between the European Union and China in a constructive way. Obviously, there are issues of digital sovereignty in the European Union and cyber sovereignty within China that would make some types of cooperation on the climate issue more problematic. But at least it's an area that there has been continued collaboration, and it's a place to begin. Whereas in the US, we're beginning fresh in the climate cooperation front as well as in the digital landscape. So it's a potential starting point. The way that I see it, one of the other major challenges that Europe faces is that while there are EU policies about engaging with China, and there's this effort to kind of build the decompartmentalized approach in the EU, there are also individual member state relations with China, and we have seen different approaches to engaging with for example, Huawei tech, or different levels of conservativeness or flexibility with regard to adopting certain types of infrastructure from China. And that, to me, seems like it will be a significant challenge of aligning the interests of European member states in relation to these kind of bigger questions of techno-nationalism. Now, more broadly, one thing that I see as a great strength of the European approach is this effort to move toward a diversified range of interests with China. Trying to find areas where there's a possibility for win-win collaboration. I hate that word. Let me take it back. Let me strike it from the record. But where there's a possibility for long-term collaboration, rather than what we're seeing increasingly in the US as the potential for long-term strategic decoupling. So I think that that's an important area to build on, and I look forward to hearing from the other panelists. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Anne. And yeah, I think one of the points we'll probably come back to in the Q&A is the increasing skepticism in some parts of Europe as to whether cooperation has the potential to be productive. Yeah. Caroline, would you like to provide some introductory comments?
Sure, thanks, Zach, and thanks so much for having me on this really great panel. Really glad to be part of this important discussion. I want to zoom in a little bit more specifically on sort of the tech and digital issues. And what I'd like to do is kind of pick out 3 aspects that I think are really important for framing our discussion later about sort of Europe's digital role and its path forward. And there are sort of 3 fundamental things that I think we need to get right when we tackle this this tricky question for which there aren't really any quick or easy answers. So the first point I want to make is one about assessing the actual tech capabilities of China and the US. I think a lot of the tech competition and tech decoupling trends that have emerged over the past years have been fueled by this widespread idea of a global tech race, especially in new generation technologies like AI or quantum computing. And there is this dominant narrative that China has already won or is well on its way to winning this kind of nebulous global tech race. And I think this narrative is somewhat oversimplified and can be misleading if it becomes a key determinant of how the EU thinks about its own tech development. And by saying that, I don't mean to dismiss China's digital advances at all or say that it isn't a leader in certain areas, but I do think that too often huge investments and ambitious national strategies are conflated to mean inevitable success or dominance. And one of the best examples is artificial intelligence, where there is this common narrative of China as already reigning or soon to be AI superpower. But the actual state of China's AI capabilities varies depending on which aspect you look at. So China's particularly strong in, for example, the application layer of AI, where Chinese companies have successfully commercialized all sorts of AI applications and developed particular strengths in areas like facial recognition and natural language processing. But then when you take a step back and look at sort of the fundamental tech layer underpinning AI, like specialized AI chips or deep learning frameworks, then actually China still lags behind the US. And so all I'm trying to say, I guess, is that I think it's crucial for Europe to look beyond this tech race narrative and for discussions about the EU's digital role to be grounded in some really thorough assessments of what the specific strengths and weaknesses are of China's tech capabilities, and of course of the US or any other countries for that matter as well. And then that enables a much more nuanced comparative assessment of Europe's own tech ecosystem and where the EU really is falling behind or where it maybe has relative strengths. The second challenge that I encounter in thinking about Europe's place in the digital divide is this vague buzzword that is US-China tech decoupling. We've all heard it, we're hearing it all the time. It's gained a lot of traction in the context of the US-China trade war, but also in the context of the pandemic amid sort of increasing fears of over-dependence on China. But decoupling is something that's much easier talked about and much easier said than actually done. And discussions often don't go into the nitty-gritty of how far decoupling can or should realistically go in the digital realm. My MERICS colleagues and I recently produced a report with the European Chamber in Beijing in which we tried to sort of peel back a little bit the different layers of decoupling. And we found that companies are experiencing different decoupling trends in different areas. And so if we speak specifically about sort of tech realm, then in research and development, for example, we found that only minimal evidence really of decoupling, where foreign companies are still really committed to China as a very attractive place to conduct R&D, even for their most advanced technologies. But then in areas like data management, ICT infrastructure, the picture is really different, where essentially by strictly enforcing data localization, China's data regime is making it more and more difficult for companies to move data across borders. And then there's the securitization of ICT supply chains that is essentially making Chinese companies purge their tech supply chains of American or even any other foreign parts. And what we found is that the costs are tremendous for companies as they try to navigate this increasing divide and often try to find ways to still sell digital solutions in both markets. So the EU really faces a delicate balancing act of hopefully avoiding US-style decoupling that could disrupt entire tech value chains, while at the same time still addressing the very real risks and vulnerabilities that the EU does face in potentially relying too much on Chinese or any other foreign technology for that matter. And that brings me to my final point, which is about defining Europe's path forward, the million-dollar question, I guess. There's been a lot of talk among policymakers about pursuing digital or tech sovereignty, but I find that there's still quite a lot of unclarity as to what that actually means in practice. And I think it's really important to talk in much more concrete terms about this, because one danger that I see is that European digital sovereignty is interpreted to mean that the EU needs to become somehow self-sufficient or independent in the tech realm. But for the most part, that is simply not possible, and neither should it be really desirable. Today's tech supply chains are so globalized and interconnected, and untangling them is a mammoth task that could also have devastating effects on innovation more broadly. The semiconductor industry is also quite a good example where Europe simply does not have enough heavyweights to be able to conduct the various steps of chip production locally. And trying to close these gaps would require immense resources, policy support, and most of all, time. And interestingly, policymakers in Brussels are now focusing on building up Europe's chip production capabilities, but it might be too little too late, really. And then I just want to quickly touch on one other different strand of thinking that has emerged when it comes to trying to define a European way in the digital world. And that's the idea of using the EU's regulatory power to set global standards for more ethical and more democratic tech development. And there the EU has taken a potentially pretty historical step in that direction 2 weeks ago with the announcement of a proposal for AI regulations. AI regulation may not sound particularly sexy in the short run for trying to, boost Europe's AI capabilities, but it could actually lead to much more sustainable AI diffusion in the long run. And make European players more competitive in that they offer more trustworthy products. But of course, the issue there also is that that approach can't come at the expense of investing in Europe's AI capabilities and innovation ecosystem. So again, the EU and individual countries really will have to follow through on the commitments that we have seen recently on really increasing investments in new technology areas like AI. I think I'll leave it at that, and I look forward to our discussion.
Thanks so much, Caroline. And yeah, it would be good in the discussion to bring out some of the specific points around where European digital sovereignty is not as far behind as the common narrative makes out, and where there are leverage points for you to become stronger. Alex, can I invite you to provide us with your thoughts for a few moments?
Yes, thank you. I love going last, particularly since I'm not a tech expert. But thank you for the opportunity to be in this great panel and participate in the discussion. I think the topic is well chosen, how the EU positions itself in the US-China relationship, including in digital policies, is one of the key strategic challenges that the EU is facing right now and will face for quite some time to come. As I said, I'm not a tech expert, so let me contribute a few observations about the geopolitical context here. It's almost a truism by now that EU-China relations are becoming ever more complex. It's not at all a truism, but a really important point of conviction to say that the EU's differentiated approach, partner, competitor, systemic rival, reflects adequately this kind of complexity. But obviously, it's not easy to achieve the appropriate balance between these three dimensions. That's why the German government has invested heavily in EU unity during our presidency, or during our EU presidency in 2020. That wasn't easy, but I think there were a few significant progress. There was a little bit of significant progress achieved there. I'm just going to name a few examples. The European Council affirmed the joint communication of March 2019, which is based on this multifaceted idea, partner, competitor, systemic rival. The 5G toolbox became the basic framework in which member states now flesh out their national 5G policies, including Germany, by the way. The IT security law that the Bundestag passed into law last week is based on the toolbox's recommendations. We created the EU human rights sanctions mechanism, which was ratified by foreign ministers last year, and that's a global instrument, but there's an obvious significance for dealing with massive human rights violations in China. As you all know, it was applied also concerning Xinjiang. Last but not least, the conclusion of political negotiations for the EU-China Comprehensive Agreement on Investment. The CAI is obviously not a cure for all, but it's a significant step in the right direction in key areas, including IP protection and market access also for digital services and IT. However, as you all know, the ratification process remains challenging and is far from certain. I think in general, we must be clear-eyed that economic and/or technological decoupling is not in our interests as Europeans. It would have significant impact on European prosperity and security. The EU's multifaceted approach is basically the only viable alternative to this. And EU unity is only the beginning of dealing with the challenges that are posed by China's rise. Much of what we have to do is not just something that's explicitly called China policy. It is also about making ourselves stronger through internal policies. And obviously, we have to deepen the cooperation with other partners, particularly in the Indo-Pacific region. Our goals on this are clear. We want to remain open. We want to strengthen competitiveness for European businesses. We want to make competition with China fairer. So this is about renegotiating the conditions for this competition. That includes improving resilience against Chinese technology acquisition practices. And it includes striving for greater reciprocity in our economic relations with China. As examples, I'm going to just name a few. It's further developing the internal market, including the digital dimension of it. It's about diversifying our trade relations in the Indo-Pacific and thereby also strengthening the resilience of our supply chains. It's about creating or strengthening the trade instruments that the EU has at its disposal. And Zach, at your introduction, you already mentioned the publication of the regulation for foreign subsidies. That's one important step there. Our starting points are always European values and interests, and these often align with US positions, but they're not exactly identical. One crucial component in this context, indeed, I think, is European technological sovereignty, not autarky or independence. I would agree that's a near impossible thing, but sovereignty. The need to retain Europe's ability to shape our own digital future. At the same time, obviously, the US and Europe share many common values and many common concerns regarding China. And that means that the transatlantic relationship has to remain close. And I think it does remain close. And we can all see how trust is being rebuilt rapidly. And that's crucial because that is also a way of gaining further leverage, because ultimately the most important part of the competition with China and with the systemic rivalry is not happening directly between us. It's happening in third countries, in the European neighborhood, in Africa, in Latin America. There'll be many places where we need the combined transatlantic leverage to work with. I think I'll leave it there, and I'm also happy to engage now in the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alex. So we'll open the floor up to questions now. As I said at the start, if you'd like to ask a question, please raise your hand using the button at the bottom